April 12th, 1861, 4:30 a.m. No one on either side of Charleston Harbor believes this will be the day that starts a war that kills more Americans than every other conflict in the nation's history combined. In the next 24 hours, a single fort will be reduced to rubble, a flag will fall and be raised 3 separate times, and not one soldier will die in actual combat. The first man killed in the Civil War will be killed by his own side's cannon, 2 days after the shooting finally stops. 4 years later, roughly 620,000 Americans will be dead. But almost none of the people watching from Charleston's rooftops this morning understand that the war has already begun. What actually happened inside those 24 hours? Why did 2 governments that both publicly claimed to want peace end up opening fire on each other anyway? And why, when the moment finally arrived, did almost no one standing at the harbor's edge truly grasp what they were starting? This is the story of the first day of the deadliest war in American history. 6 weeks earlier, Charleston, South Carolina, was already a city that had convinced itself the future had been decided. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Church bells rang across the city. Fireworks lit the harbor. Crowds packed the street outside Institute Hall to watch delegates sign the Ordinance of Secession, and when the last signature was dry, men who had never fired a weapon in anger toasted each other with champagne, certain the North would never actually fight to hold them. By February 1861, 6 more states had followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as their president, wrote a new constitution built explicitly to protect what they called their way of life, and began the work of turning a collection of state militias into something resembling a national army. Newspapers across the South ran the same confident phrase, week after week: the Yankees will never fire the first shot. They have no stomach for it. Southern politicians told their constituents that a single Southern victory, one humiliating defeat, would send the North scurrying back to the negotiating table within 90 days. Almost no one, on either side, believed they were watching the opening act of a war that would last 4 years. But sitting in the middle of Charleston Harbor was a problem neither government had figured out how to solve: Fort Sumter. A 5-sided brick fortress built on an artificial island of imported granite, designed to hold 650 men and 135 heavy guns, garrisoned in the winter of 1861 by exactly 85 soldiers, most of them enlisted men who had joined the peacetime army for a steady wage, not to fight their own countrymen. Its commander was Major Robert Anderson, a career artillery officer from Kentucky, a slaveholder himself by marriage, a man who had spent his entire adult life defending the American flag, and now found himself, almost by accident, defending it from the very region he had been born into. On December 26, 1860, 6 days after South Carolina seceded, Anderson made a decision no one in Washington had ordered. Under cover of darkness, he quietly moved his tiny garrison from the exposed, indefensible Fort Moultrie on the mainland to Fort Sumter, sitting alone in the middle of the harbor, accessible only by boat. It was the only position in Charleston that could actually be held against attack. South Carolina's governor called it a deliberate act of war. Washington called it simple military prudence. In hindsight, it was neither. It was the moment the fuse was finally lit, 6 weeks before anyone struck the match. Inside Fort Sumter, that winter, 85 men lived on steadily shrinking rations, watching new Confederate gun batteries appear on every point of land visible from the fort's walls. Private soldiers wrote letters home they weren't sure would ever be delivered through a harbor that was, for all practical purposes, already a war zone. Some of the fort's own civilian laborers, local workmen hired to help finish construction, quietly slipped away week by week to join the Confederate militia units forming just a few hundred yards across the water. By April, the men still inside Sumter were down to their last few weeks of hardtack and salt pork, and every soldier in the garrison knew exactly how the math would end if nothing changed. Across the harbor, in the city itself, 18-year-old Emma Holmes kept a diary that spring that described Charleston as a city almost giddy with anticipation. Ladies embroidered flags for newly formed militia units in their parlors. Young men who had never seen combat begged their fathers to let them enlist immediately, terrified, in their own words, that all the glory might be gone before they got their chance. There was a carnival feeling to the whole city that spring. Restaurants filled with officers in crisp new uniforms they had never worn under fire. Hotel balconies overlooking the harbor were quietly rented out in advance, for a show almost everyone assumed would be brief, decisive, and largely bloodless. Just outside the city, at plantations along the Ashley and Cooper rivers, an entirely different calculation was underway, one that survives in almost none of the diaries and letters written by the white citizens celebrating in Charleston's streets. Word of the crisis moved through the enslaved population by whispered conversation, by rumor passed along at church gatherings and in the fields, by the coded language enslaved people had developed over generations to share information their enslavers never intended them to have. Many understood, long before most Confederate leaders would admit it publicly, that whatever this war became, it would ultimately be fought over them. And in Washington, President Lincoln, barely 5 weeks into his first term, faced a decision with no clean outcome available. Evacuate Sumter, and he would be conceding, in the opening month of his presidency, that any state unhappy with an election result could simply leave the Union and the federal government would step aside, reinforce it, and he risked being the president who started a war the country had spent an entire winter trying to avoid. 4 groups of people. 4 entirely different understandings of what was about to happen. None of them controlled what came next. Here is what almost no one in Charleston or Washington said out loud that spring. By April, there was no political solution left. Not because people hadn't tried. Congress had spent the entire winter attempting compromise after compromise. The Crittenden Compromise, the Corwin Amendment. A dozen quieter backroom proposals to extend the old Missouri Compromise line westward, to guarantee slavery could never legally be touched where it already existed, to buy just enough time for tempers on both sides to cool down. Every single one of them failed. They failed because the underlying structure no longer allowed for a middle ground. 7 states had already left the Union entirely. Their new government had already ratified a constitution. They had already elected a president, minted their own currency, and seized nearly every federal fort, arsenal, and customs house located within their borders, with exactly 2 exceptions, Fort Sumter in Charleston and Fort Pickens off the coast of Florida. For the Confederacy, allowing federal troops to remain garrisoned in Charleston Harbor, the literal birthplace of secession, was not a minor administrative inconvenience they could simply tolerate. It was a daily, visible insult to the legitimacy of the entire nation they had just spent months building. And for the incoming Lincoln administration, quietly abandoning Sumter was just as politically impossible. Lincoln had spent his entire campaign insisting the Union was perpetual, that it could not simply be dissolved because one region disliked an election's outcome. If he ordered the fort evacuated in his first month in office, he would be handing secession a working blueprint, proof that any state, at any time, could simply leave, and the federal government would let it happen without consequence. There was no version of this crisis where both governments got to keep their founding story intact. Someone was eventually going to have to fire first, or someone was going to have to back down completely and publicly, and by April, backing down completely was no longer politically survivable for either side. This was the real trap. Not passion alone, not hatred, not yet, not fully. Structure. 2 governments that had each, through dozens of smaller decisions made over several months, slowly removed their own ability to compromise, one concession at a time, until compromise itself was no longer an available option. Almost no one remembers this part, and that forgetting is itself part of the story. In February 1861, while South Carolina's batteries were already ringing Charleston Harbor, delegates from 21 states quietly gathered in Washington for what history now calls the Peace Conference, a last, largely secret attempt to find some compromise that might hold the Union together without a single state needing to fire a shot. Former President John Tyler, elderly and increasingly irrelevant, was somehow talked into chairing it. For 3 full weeks, delegates debated constitutional amendments almost no one outside that room would ever hear about. Proposals to permanently guarantee slavery where it already existed, to divide future Western territories along a fixed geographic line, to make it nearly impossible for the federal government to ever interfere with slavery again without unanimous consent from every remaining slave state. It was, in almost every sense, exactly the kind of compromise that had worked for previous generations of American politicians. Split the difference. Draw a new line on the map. Let both sides walk away claiming a partial victory. And by early March, the conference actually produced a formal proposal and sent it to Congress for a vote. Congress rejected it almost immediately, and for reasons that reveal exactly how far the country had already drifted from compromise being possible at all. Southern delegates increasingly viewed compromise itself as no longer worth pursuing. 7 states had already left, and the practical work of building a separate nation was already well underway in Montgomery. Northern delegates, meanwhile, increasingly viewed further concessions on slavery as a betrayal of the election that had just installed Lincoln in the first place. The last formal, organized attempt to prevent the Civil War through negotiation died quietly in a Senate committee room, barely covered by the newspapers of the day, roughly 5 weeks before the first shell arced over Fort Sumter. A handful of people understood exactly where all of this was heading, and almost none of them were listened to. General Winfield Scott, the aging commanding general of the entire U.S. Army, told Lincoln bluntly in March that Sumter could not be resupplied by sea without triggering a fight, and that the fight, once it started, would not stay contained to a single harbor. He recommended quiet evacuation instead. He was overruled by the president's own cabinet, several of whom argued that abandoning the fort without a fight would be read across the country as weakness. Major Anderson himself, The man actually trapped inside the fort with his shrinking supplies wrote to Washington in February, warning explicitly that any attempt to reinforce his garrison by sea would almost certainly trigger the exact confrontation everyone in Washington claimed to be trying to avoid. His warnings were read, filed, and quietly set aside in favor of a political solution no one had actually found yet. And in Charleston itself, a small number of older, more cautious secessionist leaders, men who had genuinely supported leaving the Union but privately dreaded what might come after, urged patience instead of action. Wait, Sumter out, they argued. Anderson's men were already starving on a fixed timetable. In a matter of weeks, hunger alone would force the fort's surrender without a single shot ever needing to be fired, and the Confederacy could claim a clean, bloodless victory without ever becoming the side that started a shooting war in front of the entire world. They were ignored too. Because by early April, patience was no longer the dominant mood inside Charleston. The city wanted resolution, and it wanted it visibly, publicly, and soon. On April 8th, 1861, a messenger from Washington arrived in Charleston carrying a short, carefully worded note addressed to the governor of South Carolina. It said, in essence, ships are already on their way to resupply Fort Sumter with food, not weapons, not additional soldiers, unless you choose to attack them first. It was designed as a trap, and nearly everyone involved immediately recognized it as one. If the Confederacy allowed the relief ships through unopposed, Sumter would remain in Union hands indefinitely, an open, unresolved wound sitting in the middle of Charleston Harbor for as long as anyone could predict. But if the Confederacy fired to stop the ships from landing, the South, not the North, would become the side that started the shooting, handing Lincoln exactly the justification he needed in front of the entire watching world. Confederate President Jefferson Davis convened his cabinet in Montgomery, Alabama, and the debate that followed was fierce. Secretary of State Robert Toombs reportedly warned Davis directly that firing the first shot would be, in his own words, suicide, that it would instantly unite a divided and uncertain North behind Lincoln, transforming a fragile political crisis into a full-scale war almost overnight. Davis listened carefully to the warning. And then he ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard, commanding Confederate forces around Charleston, to formally demand Sumter's surrender, and if that demand was refused, to open fire before the relief ships could arrive and land. On the evening of April 11th, Confederate officers rode out to Fort Sumter under a flag of truce and formally demanded that Major Anderson surrender the fort immediately. Anderson refused, but added something almost apologetic to his refusal. He told the Confederate officers that if they simply waited a few more days, hunger alone would force his surrender anyway, with no bloodshed required from either side. He was, in effect, quietly echoing exactly what the cautious voices back in Charleston had been arguing for weeks. The Confederate command relayed Anderson's answer back to Beauregard. Beauregard relayed it onward to Davis's government in Montgomery. And at 3:20 in the morning, on April 12th, the final reply came back across the wires to Charleston Harbor. Fire. 4:30 a.m., April 12th. In the darkness above Fort Johnson, on the southern edge of the harbor, a single mortar fires a signal shell that arcs high over the black water and bursts directly above Fort Sumter's walls. It is, by most surviving accounts, fired at the personal request of 67-year-old Edmund Ruffin, a longtime pro-secession writer who had traveled specifically to Charleston hoping to witness, and if possible, personally fire, what he believed would become the opening shot of the war. Within seconds of the signal shell's explosion, every Confederate battery ringing the harbor, more than 40 separate guns and mortars positioned across multiple points of land, opens fire simultaneously. 4:35 a.m. inside Fort Sumter, the garrison wakes to the sound of shells exploding against brick walls that were, decades earlier, specifically engineered to withstand exactly this kind of bombardment. Major Anderson calmly orders his men to eat breakfast first. There is no ammunition to waste responding in panic. His entire remaining supply of gunpowder cartridges for the fort's largest guns amounts to just over 700, nowhere near enough for a sustained fight against 40 active batteries, and most of the fort's heaviest cannons, mounted exposed on the fort's upper tier, cannot even be safely crewed under direct fire without losing men he cannot afford to lose. 7 a.m. Fort Sumter finally answers. Captain Abner Doubleday, later inaccurately mythologized as the inventor of baseball, personally fires the first Union shot of the entire war, aimed directly at the Confederate ironclad battery positioned on Cummings Point. It does almost no visible damage. The battery's iron-plated construction, one of the earliest uses of ironclad defenses anywhere in American warfare, deflects the incoming shell entirely, and Doubleday watches it bounce harmlessly off the metal into the surf. Mid-morning, word of the bombardment spreads rapidly through Charleston. Rooftops and church steeples across the city fill, with spectators within the hour, entire families arriving with borrowed opera glasses, street vendors moving through the crowds, selling food and drink, an entire city turning out to watch what most of them still believe will be a brief, almost bloodless spectacle unfolding across the water like a fireworks display arranged for their entertainment. Emma Holmes writes in her diary that she can hear the guns clearly from her family's house, and that the whole city has effectively turned out to watch, cheering audibly with every visible hit against the fort's walls. Noon. Just beyond the harbor entrance, a small Union relief squadron under the command of Captain Gustavus Fox sits nearly helpless at anchor, well within sight of the smoke but unable to intervene. The ships carrying troops and supplies intended to reinforce Sumter had been badly delayed by a violent storm at sea days earlier, and the warships meant to escort them safely through Confederate fire have arrived without their landing boats, without enough trained men aboard, without any real practical ability to break through the ring of shore batteries. Fox watches the entire bombardment unfold from a distance through his spyglass, unable to do anything but wait for an opportunity that will never actually come. In almost every meaningful way, it is the exact same structural failure as the banker's dramatic rescue attempt during the 1929 crash. A highly visible intervention that arrives on the scene with none of the actual power needed to change what happens next. 1 p.m., April 12th. Inside the fort, a young private named John Carmody, tired of watching from below while officers debated which guns could safely be crewed, quietly climbs to the exposed upper tier alone and begins firing the fort's largest cannons himself, without orders, simply because no one had specifically told him not to. He fires nearly a dozen rounds before an officer finally notices and orders him back down. It is one of the only moments of individual initiative recorded on either side that entire day, buried in a fort otherwise defined by rationing, waiting, and calculation. Afternoon. The bombardment continues without any real pause through the middle of the day. Fort Sumter's wooden barracks and officers' quarters, structures never designed to withstand sustained direct mortar fire, begin to visibly smoke from repeated hits. Anderson's exhausted men managed to keep only about 6 guns firing steadily throughout the day, a small fraction of the fort's total available armament, carefully rationing the limited powder cartridges they have left for as long as they possibly can. On the surrounding shoreline, enslaved laborers, forced to work constructing and reinforcing several of the very batteries firing on the fort, continue their assigned labor throughout the bombardment, mixing mortar and hauling shot for a battle over a system that held them in bondage, a detail almost entirely absent from the celebratory accounts Charleston's white residents wrote that same week. Nightfall, April 12th. The guns on both sides fall largely silent for the night, exhausted crews on both shores too worn down and too limited by darkness to continue accurate firing. Inside the fort, the garrison has fired roughly 1,000 rounds over the course of the day and absorbed hundreds more in return. Remarkably, not one man on either side has been killed. Some of Anderson's soldiers, in what surviving witnesses later described as sheer physical exhaustion, actually fall asleep between the thick walls of the fort's ammunition magazine while occasional shells continue landing somewhere outside in the darkness. Early morning, April 13th. The bombardment resumes again at first light, and this time it is markedly more dangerous. Red-hot shot, cannonballs deliberately heated in furnaces built along the shore before being fired, begin striking the fort's wooden interior structures directly. By mid-morning, the officers' quarters inside Fort Sumter are fully ablaze, flames climbing visibly above the fort's brick walls where the entire city can see them. Smoke fills the parade ground so thickly that men inside can barely breathe, let alone aim their remaining guns with any accuracy. Anderson orders most of his remaining gunpowder barrels physically moved and flooded with seawater, a desperate measure to prevent the spreading fire from reaching the fort's main magazine and detonating the entire structure with his men still inside it. Around noon, April 13th, the flagpole flying the American flag over Fort Sumter is struck directly by incoming fire and snaps in half. For several agonizing minutes, watched from both the Confederate lines and from every rooftop in Charleston, it appears the fort has finally surrendered. Then, through the drifting smoke, a small party of soldiers is seen jury-rigging the fallen flag onto a makeshift staff and raising it again above the walls. The bombardment does not slow in response. If anything, it visibly intensifies, as though both sides suddenly understand they are no longer just exchanging fire, they are now fighting over what that flag has come to symbolize in front of an entire watching city. Early afternoon. A Confederate officer, former United States Senator Louis Wigfall, watches the smoke and flames from his position on Cummings Point and, entirely without orders from Beauregard, rows out towards Sumter alone under a white handkerchief tied to the tip of his sword, intending to personally negotiate a ceasefire before the fort's remaining defenders are killed by the fire itself. Anderson, his men exhausted, his ammunition nearly gone, his fort visibly burning around him, agrees to sit down and discuss terms. 2:30 p.m., April 13th, 1861. After more than a full day of continuous bombardment, Major Robert Anderson formally agrees to surrender Fort Sumter to Confederate forces. Not one soldier on either side has died in actual combat during the entire engagement. The surrender terms were, by the standards of what was coming for the rest of the country, almost gentle. Anderson and his men would be permitted to formally salute their flag with a 100-gun ceremony before finally lowering it, and would then be allowed to evacuate peacefully by ship north to New York, carrying their personal weapons and colors with them. General Beauregard, who had once studied artillery tactics under Anderson years earlier at West Point, personally arranged the surrender terms specifically to preserve his old instructor's professional dignity in defeat. On April 14th, during that farewell salute, a stray spark from one of the ceremonial cannons ignited a pile of stored powder cartridges stacked nearby for the ceremony. The resulting explosion killed Private Daniel Ho almost instantly and mortally wounded a second soldier standing near him. Daniel Ho became the first fatality of the American Civil War, killed not by a single shot of enemy fire, but by his own side's ceremonial salute, 2 full days after tens of thousands of rounds fired in anger had somehow failed to kill a single man in actual combat. News of Sumter's fall reached the North by telegraph within hours, and the public reaction stunned almost everyone who had spent the winter quietly, assuming this crisis would simply fade the way so many earlier ones had. Crowds filled the streets of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia within a day, not to protest the coming war, but to demand it immediately. Newspapers that had spent the previous months arguing loudly for compromise and patience flipped overnight into calls for swift retaliation. On April 15th, President Lincoln issued a formal proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to help suppress what he officially termed an insurrection against lawful government. That single proclamation accomplished, in a matter of days, what 6 full weeks of secession conventions and quiet cabinet debates had failed to achieve. Virginia, which had voted decisively against secession only a few weeks earlier, reversed its position entirely and left the Union on April 17th. Arkansas followed on May 6th. North Carolina and Tennessee followed by early June. The Confederacy, 7 states strong on the morning the first shell arced over Fort Sumter, was 11 states strong within barely 2 months, precisely because Lincoln's call for troops finally forced the remaining border states to choose a side they had spent the entire winter desperately trying to avoid choosing. While Charleston celebrated in the streets, and Washington scrambled to organize an army from almost nothing, a quieter, considerably more cynical calculation was already well underway in both capitals. Within days of Sumter's fall, government contracts for uniforms, weapons, horses, tents, and food supplies began flowing rapidly to well-connected manufacturers on both sides, many of them delivering rushed, overpriced, and badly made goods to a war effort nobody had actually prepared to fight. In the North, so-called shoddy contractors made rapid fortunes selling uniforms that quite literally dissolved in the rain and boots that fell apart within a matter of weeks. A scandal so widespread and so notorious that it permanently added a new insult to the English language, shoddy. Cotton speculators on both sides of the Atlantic, correctly anticipating that a Union naval blockade would soon choke off Southern cotton exports almost entirely, had spent the preceding winter quietly buying up existing cotton stockpiles at low prices, carefully positioning themselves to sell later at enormous markups the moment global supply suddenly dried up. Some of the very same Charleston merchants cheering loudest from their rooftops on the morning of April 12th had already, weeks earlier, quietly moved their own personal capital into exactly those speculative trades. This is the pattern that repeats across almost every catastrophe built on gradual structural fracture rather than sudden accident. The people standing closest to the actual decision, the ones who understand the underlying mechanism well before it finally breaks, quietly position themselves to benefit from the break itself, while the people watching from the streets, cheering or grieving depending on which side they stood on, experience the entire event as something that simply happened to them without warning. What makes Fort Sumter especially strange, in hindsight, is how little it actually changed people's expectations about the war itself. Despite more than a full day of continuous bombardment, despite a fort left smoking and half destroyed, despite Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops, both sides continued to genuinely believe, for months afterward, that the whole conflict would be brief. 3 months later, in July 1861, that belief reached its almost surreal peak. When Union and Confederate armies finally met in serious battle for the first time near Manassas, Virginia, along a creek called Bull Run, dozens of civilians from Washington rode out from the capital in carriages to watch, bringing picnic baskets, opera glasses, and bottles of wine, treating the first major land battle of the war as a form of weekend entertainment, exactly the way Charleston's rooftops had treated the bombardment of Sumter months earlier. Senators and their wives spread blankets on nearby hillsides, expecting to watch a quick, decisive Union victory that would effectively end the rebellion by nightfall. Instead, Confederate forces routed the Union Army so completely that the retreat became a chaotic, panicked stampede back toward Washington, tangled up with the very carriages that had come out to watch a picnic. It was the first hard evidence, for anyone still willing to see it, that this war would not be measured in weeks. It would eventually be measured in years, and in hundreds of thousands of graves. The same pattern that shaped April 12th at Fort Sumter, confident spectators, genuine surprise at the outcome, a total failure to grasp the actual scale of what had already been set in motion, simply repeated itself 3 months later on a much larger, much bloodier stage. Fort Sumter's bombardment killed no one in actual combat. The war it started killed more Americans than World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. By the time it finally ended in April 1865, exactly 4 years after the guns first opened fire across Charleston Harbor, an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers were dead, alongside an unknown but substantial number of civilian deaths, roughly 2% of the entire American population at the time. Adjusted for today's population, that percentage would translate to more than 6 million deaths in a single conflict. The structural trap that made war feel functionally unavoidable by April 1861, the impossibility of real compromise once secession had already occurred, once federal forts had already been seized, once both governments had already staked their entire legitimacy on the outcome, did not end the moment Sumter surrendered. It simply moved from negotiating tables in Washington and Montgomery to battlefields across the continent, where it would continue operating relentlessly for 4 more years, at a scale of destruction no one standing on a Charleston rooftop that April morning could have possibly imagined. Out of that catastrophe eventually came reforms almost no one in 1861 genuinely believed were politically possible. The 13th Amendment, formally abolishing slavery throughout the United States. The 14th, guaranteeing citizenship and equal legal protection to those who had been enslaved. The 15th, extending the right to vote regardless of race. None of it came easily, none of it came completely or immediately, and the country would go on to spend more than a century, arguably is still spending today, working through the war's genuinely unfinished business. Major Robert Anderson returned north from Sumter as an unlikely hero, greeted by cheering crowds in New York who treated the man who had surrendered a fort as though he had won a great victory, simply for holding out as long as he had. His health, already fragile before the siege, never fully recovered from the strain of those 2 days under fire. He returned to Fort Sumter one final time in April 1865, days before Lincoln's assassination, to personally raise the same flag that had fallen and been re-raised 3 times 4 years earlier, this time over a Union victorious and a South in ruins. He died in 1871, still remembered primarily for the fort he lost. General P.G.T. Beauregard went on to become one of the Confederacy's most prominent generals, commanding forces at Bull Run and later at Shiloh, though his relationship with Jefferson Davis soured badly as the war dragged on. After the Confederacy's defeat, he spent his later years advocating, somewhat unexpectedly, for reconciliation between North and South, and even supported limited black civil rights in post-war Louisiana, a striking reversal for the man who had ordered the war's opening shots. Edmund Ruffin, the elderly secessionist who had traveled to Charleston specifically to help fire the war's first shots, lived to see the Confederacy he had spent decades advocating for utterly destroyed. In June 1865, 2 months after Lee's surrender, unwilling to live under a restored Union, he wrapped himself in a Confederate flag and took his own life, leaving behind a diary entry expressing what he called unmitigated hatred for Yankee rule to his final breath. And President Abraham Lincoln, who had spent his first 5 weeks in office trying to thread a needle between provoking a war and legitimizing secession, would not live to see the country he held together fully reunited. He was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, almost exactly 4 years to the day after Fort Sumter's garrison lowered its flag in surrender. Today, more Americans than at any point in recent decades describe their political opponents not simply as people they happen to disagree with, but as an existential threat to the country itself. Surveys conducted by political scientists at multiple American universities have found a significant share of people on both sides of the political spectrum now say political violence could be justified in pursuit of their goals, numbers that would have sounded genuinely unthinkable a single generation ago, and eerily familiar to anyone who has actually read a Charleston newspaper from the winter of 1861. None of this means history is somehow guaranteed to repeat itself on command. It rarely does, and the differences between 1861 and today matter enormously. Modern America has institutions, checks, and shared civic memory that simply did not exist in 1861, and predicting collapse from polarization numbers alone would be its own kind of overconfidence. But structural erosion does something quieter and more dangerous than sudden crisis. It removes, one small decision at a time, month after month, the very compromises that once made backing down politically possible, until the people actually holding the guns, or the ballots, or the microphones, are the very last to realize the underlying choice was already made for them, long before anyone fired a single shot. In 1860, almost no single decision looked like the cause of a war. The Missouri Compromise's slow unraveling, the Dred Scott decision, a contested election, a fort quietly relocated in the middle of the night. Individually, each one was survivable. Stacked together, they left no room left to maneuver. Fort Sumter did not begin with pure hatred. It began with a long series of individually defensible decisions, each one reasonable enough in isolation, that gradually and almost invisibly closed every available door except one. By the time that first mortar fired at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the war itself had effectively already been decided weeks earlier. The only thing genuinely left to determine that morning was who would fire first, and how long everyone else would take to admit what had already, quietly, become inevitable. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more of the hidden mechanics behind history's turning points, the ones textbooks tend to compress into a single sentence, but that actually unfolded hour by hour, decision by decision, exactly the way this one did.